Welcome back, everybody, to the latest episode of Steelers Draft Talk. I'm your host, Derrick Bell. With me is my good buddy, Nick Martin. Today, we're going to do have some discussions about NIL and how it's affecting kind of the draft process in general. Get into some prospects that we've watched recently, and then touch on some bowl games this weekend. But first, Nick, how we doing, brother?
I'm doing pretty good. Looking forward to a very cold week of football with this Arctic blast coming in. Definitely going to shake up the landscape a bit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was looking at the wind chills for the games this weekend. Like in Pittsburgh, it's supposed to be like -11 or something like that for the wind chill.
Feels like -4 or something like that.
Oh,
Like, ugh,
yeah,
terrible.
it's gonna be brutal. Yeah, even here in Louisville, it's really it's frigid already, but at least early in the morning. But on Friday, I think it's supposed to get down to negative degrees here. So definitely going to be different. There's always this discussion about what is football weather. Football weather to me is like, when it's cold, but when we're getting down in these temperatures, that's not football
Yeah.
weather. That's taking it a little too far.
Don't want
Um,
no freezer bowl action like the
yeah,
Cincinnati Chargers game back in the day.
yeah. This is taking it a little too far in my opinion, but it is what it is. Let's talk a little bit about NIL and just some of the things that have changed from a draft landscape perspective. We've gotten recent news in the past couple of days that Bo Nix is headed back to Oregon. He was kind of one of the ones that sparked this kind of conversation, along with Michael Penix going back to Washington for another year. And I wanted to get your thoughts on how you think NIL is kind of changing the NFL draft process for a lot of these players, not just the quarterbacks, but a lot of these players. And where do you see this kind of going forward?
So for me, from what I understand, Bo Nix was probably going to be going somewhere around the day 2 area. Penix, there was a lot less certainty about his draft stock overall, but I think it gives quarterbacks a lot more incentive to want to win in college more than anything. Bo has a good reason to go back. Dan Lanning's building a really good program over at Oregon. A lot of good recruits coming in. A lot of transfers and guys. They really overperformed to their expectations this season. Bo was a huge part of that, and he was in the Heisman running at one point, and Bo probably sees what that program has done. He sees that guys like Will Levis can be going into 24 and still get drafted really high if the NFL really likes you. So if he thinks he can change his stock from a little bit towards the day 2 area towards like day 1 while still competing in college and making money in college, it makes a lot of sense for him to go back. You see probably the same thing with Kayshon Boutte, who had a really down year for LSU, but LSU's building they're building something really great down there, and they showed a lot of promise with like their wins over like Alabama at the time, and at one point LSU was ranked in the top 5. There was a lot to go. Of there's a lot more incentive to want to win in college now, and I think that's the big thing overall. It's a bit better thing for college football. It may help development in the long term, but development is not always linear, as we say every single year. Guys don't always just go improvement into straight line. You know, if Bo Nix wants to improve and get his draft stock up, obviously, good luck to him on that. But we we don't expect development year in and year out. We kind of have to wait and see more than project. But those are overall some of my thoughts I had to get out.
Yeah, it's both of those guys are really interesting in my opinion. Penix had a lot of medical related questions. He's dealt with a ton of injuries from collarbones to just basically everything under the sun. This kid dealt with a bunch of adversity at Indiana before transferring to Washington, where he had that kind of breakout this season. I just think from a financial perspective, it makes a lot of sense for some of these guys, particularly at the quarterback position or bigger names where you're going to get more recognition. Penix, even if he was going to be drafted on day 3, even though we both think he has the talent to maybe go a little bit higher than that if you can get past the injury related questions. You look at what like backup quarterbacks are making if you're drafted on day 3 of the draft. For an example, a guy that was drafted really late this year that comes to mind is a guy like Skylar Thompson from Miami. He ended up making the roster. He's played a little bit thanks to injuries, to Tua, to Teddy. But like you even look at his contract, it's like 4 years, like 3.8 million. Obviously, really good money. He's doing really well for himself, but the difference there between being drafted on day 2, where you're making that kind of salary, you're paying that crazy amount of taxes, when you can go back to college and make more money probably on a year-to-year basis. Like you don't have maybe as much long-term security, but he can, like I would guarantee that Penix is going to get more than that, like 800,000 range at Washington. So I think it's a good thing, like you said, for development and to where like some of these guys can get some financial security and not feel rushed to get into the league as soon as possible, even if they're not ready. And then for Knicks, you mentioned that, day 2 stock was kind of on the table, especially in this draft class where we're kind of in a little bit of a wait and see mode for whoever those guys were going to be post, Young, Stroud, and Levis. Knicks, to me, makes sense too. Oregon is at the very forefront of NIL right now. They've got Phil Knight, really incorporated in the things that they're doing for the school in order to, help the student athletes maximize their earning potential. And you think about Knicks, that arrow is still pointing up, man. Like he was a guy that has always been talented, but a lot of people wrote off, including really myself, honestly. Once he left Auburn, he explodes this year at Oregon, has a crazy season, ends up wanting to run it back there. The difference in money and your contract between being a day 2 guy and being sliding into that first round is completely different, man. It's so much of a difference in terms of guaranteed money. And if you can sneak into that first round conversation, and I don't think that that's too crazy of a thought for Knicks next year if we continue to see some improvement and just overall stability in his game. So just the financial aspects of it, going back to school and still being able to make some money without, completely forfeiting, that opportunity in the future. I think it's really intriguing.
Yeah, completely agreed. And, also makes like quarterback is a difficult position. There's in terms of development, you're going to see it's the big moneymaker, obviously, but a lot of quarterbacks go in, they think they're better than they actually are, and then they end up going a lot later and they end up getting hit with that reality. And a lot of times, if you have the incentive to go back to college and not have to worry about that money, while also it takes the stress off of wanting to get into the NFL immediately, but also just allowing you to work at your own pace, because a lot of times these guys develop at their own pace. Now, some might have that sudden jump from like a year to year basis, and some might be a very gradual type growing process. Guys like Dak Prescott comes to mind. Dak Prescott got better every year he was at Mississippi State. And a lot, putting that into account, just making sure that you can play as many years as you can at college, especially with how murky a lot of the eligibility is right now, with a ton of the COVID years going, a lot of guys still going around right now. You want to maximize that playing time. You want to make someone look at your age and be like, okay, this guy plays to that age, and that's what you want to you want to see, that experience, that growth. That more than anything is probably the biggest takeaway for me, though.
Yeah, for sure. Also, I thought Narduzzi's comments about, that he knows of teams that, were willing to drop, $5 million in NIL money to get Drake May away from North Carolina. There was some weird rumblings too about May, like maybe potentially leaving a couple of weeks ago. I'm guessing that's probably where that came from, was, a lot of teams are kind of trespassing a little bit, trying to get him away. I know Narduzzi's not been shy about, what happened with Jordan Addison in terms
Yeah.
of how USC was able to kind of poach him last year. Wasn't happy about how that went down. As much as I don't really care for Narduzzi's personal comments, sometimes I think he oversteps, but it's a different landscape. And, it obviously affects college football a ton. It affects, the NFL draft process a ton. But overall, I think it's just a good thing in general for these kids to be able to, provide for themselves, provide for their families without having to make an unnecessary jump that they really aren't ready for, physically, mentally, those types of things. So,
Yeah.
interesting discussion about the ever-changing landscape. Let's get into a couple prospects that we've been watching this week. Who have you had your eye on?
So this one actually caught my eye while I was watching the bowl game. It was the Myrtle Beach Bowl. It was between Marshall and UConn, and I started to notice their corner, Stephen Gilmore, who is actually related to Stephon Gilmore. He's listed around 6'1", 170 on the official site. I guarantee you this guy is going to measure in a decent bit shorter than that. I've seen some plays where he was matched up with Mitchell Tinsley, who was listed at 6'1" at the time for Western Kentucky, who now plays at Penn State. He is measured around 6'1", and he had a good bit of height length on him. But Gilmore, really impressive. I saw him on the hip pocket of receivers. I saw some makeup speed, but I also saw ball skills. He had an incredible attempt at playing the ball. This ball looked like it was going out of bounds. He goes and tries to has like almost a highlight worthy like toe drag, just barely couldn't control it at time. But I love seeing the ability to find the ball in the air. I went and I watched a little bit more of him, and he had a pick six against Notre Dame at the time that won them the game. I'm kind of impressed, honestly. Like I'm a sucker for these corners who are a little bit shorter. They play a little bit feistier, but they have this aggressiveness going downhill. He explodes downhill for one. He plays with good. He plays with good. He's good technique. Guy who does not let he uses the sideline to his advantage. He's great. He doesn't have a lot of length from what I've noticed, but he knows how to use it, and he knows how to keep guys pinned towards the sideline. Can explode downhill from an off coverage perspective. Just really like I'm a sucker for these type of guys because Damari Mathis to me last year, guy who's explosive, could absolutely tackle.
Physical.
Yes, I love those types of corners. And Gilmore, while he mainly plays on the outside, I could see a team projecting him pretty well in the slot as a nickel because of his ability to blitz and just how feisty, how aggressive he is. You want those in your slot corners. Definitely a guy I'm keeping an eye out for Pittsburgh a good bit as a second corner that they could end up taking in this year's draft. That's a guy I'm keeping my eyes on.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I've been watching a good amount of corners as well. Really just trying to get my full thoughts on the class because it's been so interesting to me because I wasn't really anticipating this class being all that great. Um, just because I didn't feel like heading into the season we had the top list of names that we did the year prior. But I really like the class in general. I think it's developing some top end talent, and then I think the depth of the class is kind of appearing more and more nice to me as well. But the guy that I've really been stuck watching, and I have a tendency to do this with players that I really like. I watch way too much film instead of moving on to more players, but it's Christian Gonzalez. I've talked about him a little bit on here. I'm planning on writing about this for the site here in the next week or two, but Gonzalez to me looks like the best corner in the draft. Right now, I don't know that it's extremely close either. I'm still waiting on some more film on Joey Porter Jr. to come in, but I just think Gonzalez, what he can do and what he gives you athletically is just so freaking appealing. He's got good size. he's an incredible athlete. Like on the GPS, I think they got him at 23.3 miles per hour. He's a former track guy.
That's
He's got
blazing.
good length. What I really like with him in press, man, whenever he's pressing receivers at the line of scrimmage, really, really patient, light feet. Doesn't ever. It's almost never that I see him open the gate too early. He's excellent at just staying square, staying patient, making the receiver declare if he's going inside, outside. Um, and then just the overall fluidity, like change of direction, there's burst. I mean, his hips are super, super fluid, man. Some of the times where like he just has to open up and run, there's not a single bit of a delay there. And I think that is so valuable in terms of, a guy that can play at the line of scrimmage. I think that there's going to be plenty of debates between like him and Porter Jr. or Keely Ringo. Just in terms of Ringo, because I've seen a bunch of him, I think the biggest differences between the two is, Ringo he's also an incredible athlete, but I think he's just really well built. Like he has a safety almost kind of build, and that physicality and that strength does come up with him on tape when it comes to like taking on blockers and being physical and playing like the run game. So those things I really appreciate. And as a tackler, those things I really appreciate with Ringo that maybe Gonzalez doesn't offer. But I just think the transitions from Gonzalez, the footwork, and just the overall technique separate him from Ringo. And that's kind of the things that I value a little bit more in terms of when I'm looking for a boundary corner that is going to project at the highest level and probably go in the first half of the first round. Those things matter a lot to me. So Gonzalez is a guy that the arrow is pointing straight up. And I think that Ringo's the biggest hat that I think he had to kind of put out there was like his athleticism. And that was why we kind of expected him to take a jump this year with more playing time. But I think Gonzalez matches that athleticism and there's just more overall refinement. And I just don't see with Ringo, I have concerns about the change of direction. The transitions are a little clunky sometimes. And then the overall ball skills are non-existent. Like he just does not locate the football. Whereas Gonzalez, transitions are pretty good in my opinion, really fluid. And then the ball skills for him, he's been making plays on the ball all season long. I mean, he had 3-4 interceptions at least this year. Some of the jaw-dropping variety. So to me, he's kind of the guy that I'm looking for in terms of the tops in this class.
Yeah, you mentioned the transitions with Ringo versus Gonzalez. I definitely noticed that whenever Ringo was actually a little bit slower out of transitioning versus Gonzalez. It was something that I was kind of surprised with, honestly, because I think Ringo thinks he can win a lot with his speed and his makeup speed, his athleticism, and I think that could catch up to him in the NFL a good bit. Because while he's playing in the SEC, I definitely do think there's going to be a transition period for him overall, and you definitely want to see a little bit more refinement in your hand placement and just your technique overall.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm losing my words a bit. And I need to watch more Porter Jr. as well. Like I saw most of him last year and I wasn't, too impressed last year, but this year I'm very curious to see what overall growth that he's made. Going off of the corner position, I was actually gonna talk about a guy I was watching centers, Joe Tippmann from Wisconsin. I was pretty shocked when I started watching this guy. I was like, he's declared early as a junior, so and he's gonna be probably about 22 years old. I'd have to guess. He is Bruce Feldman on the Bruce Feldman Freaks list. Had one of the top 10-second splits out of his 40 times, clocking in a 165, but also a 4.31 agility time, which would have been faster than any lineman at the combine this past year. The thing with Tippmann that really stood out with me, this is a guy who's he's large. He's listed around like 6'6", like 317-ish or so. And his strength really shows up on film. But what was surprising, it was his leverage. For a guy as tall as he is, I never saw him really look like a liability when it came to getting beat from the leverage advantage. Like, he was a guy who showed surprising amount of bend in his knees, could and like I really liked his ability to use his hands. His hands have a lot of shock behind them, really good independent hand usage overall. Big thing with me, his anchor just sticks out like a sore thumb. He will get bull rushed and he will just like he will probably move back about few inches, ends up just standing there. He is a rock in pass protection, and this guy can pull in the run game too. What I love seeing more than anything is a center that can freaking pull. And when you're listing around 6'6", like 317, and you can move like that and generate that like push up front in the run game, that really catches my attention. Like, honestly, kind of reminded me a bit of Landon Dickerson back at Alabama in terms of a guy, because Tippmann actually was a former offensive tackle recruit coming out of high school. So he's played tackle, but he played center mostly for Wisconsin, and it's just been his home. He really looks at home at that position, even though he's a lot bigger, similar to Dickerson. Maybe he meant, and maybe you can move him to guard. He shows that surprising amount of power, that anchor, to be able to hold up there. Overall, big fan of this guy. I think I might end up having him a little bit higher than I expected. Guy I was really impressed with overall. I think you'd end up pretty liking him too once you get around to his film.
Yeah, I'm definitely intrigued on the center class for sure. I mean, there's a couple of guys that I've watched that I've really been a fan of so far, but centers are always it's always tough, man, because it's usually slim pickings.
Right.
We're only usually going to get a handful of these guys that get drafted, but Tippmann's a guy that I really want to watch. I've already seen one or two centers. I've seen Jared Patterson a lot at Notre Dame because he was a guy I think that was potentially going to come out last year, and he ended up going back to school. I've seen Stromberg from Arkansas too, but definitely interested in diving into the center class a little bit more. All right, let's talk. Let's talk a little bit about bowl game stuff before we head out of here. I had a couple matchups I think are really intriguing to watch for this weekend in some frigid temperatures. The main one being Wake Forest and Missouri going to get the chance to see A.T. Perry play. Perry was a guy coming into the season that I was extremely high on. I loved his film over the summer. He is such a uniquely built individual, 6'5", 205 with like 99 percentile arm length. The dude just runs like a gazelle, and it's really fun to watch. He gets up to that top speed really quickly. He's a glider with long strides. And what I really like about him, he's a vertical receiver, a linear type guy, as you'd expect for somebody with his build. But, he tracks the ball very well and he has nice body control, which I really like because sometimes one of the pet peeves of mine with speed guys is like when they beat their defender, they get that guy stacked and then they can't track the football in the air. We've seen it a gazillion times with like Chase Claypool, even though he's not the greatest at even stacking guys, but just the inability to play the ball when it's in the air with your body control or just track the football over your shoulder. But Perry does that extremely well. I've actually been really surprised by him in press coverage. Like when guys have gotten up into a phone booth with him, he's pretty good. He has a nice little release package for him, which, is another struggle for a lot of like vertical receivers coming out. But there's a big matchup in this one. Missouri actually has a couple of really good cornerbacks. They had a Caleb Evans, I think, last year or the year before. But they've got two more guys with kind of NFL type potential. In particular, Abrams Drain and Rakestraw. Abrams Drain actually, I think he said that he got third round grades from the NFL, but ended up coming back to school. He's a former receiver that's made the transition to corner in college. He's only got like a year and a half, 2 years worth of experience. So he said he came back to work on his technique. But I'm really interested in that matchup for sure. Going to get the chance to see Perry, who, in my opinion, he's a day 2 guy through and through. I think he's going to be like a second round type of grade for me, just based on what I've seen live. But he's a really special player, and this is one of those matchups you really look forward to from a draft perspective, to see him against some really good competition. Let's see who else we got. Yeah, there's one more too. Not really necessarily like a matchup, but just a guy that I really want to see play. Tank Dell from Houston, Clayton Tunes, kind of go-to guy there. They play Louisiana on Friday as well. Both these games are on Friday if y'all trying to tune in. But Dell, 5'10", only about 155 pounds. This dude is really, really light. He is very, very thin. But he's already declared for the draft, but he's going to play in the bowl game, which I really like. So chance to boost his stock. But dude's been incredibly productive. I mean, back-to-back 1,300-yard years. I think last year he finished with like 12 touchdowns. This year he's up to 15. The first time that I actually noticed him was when I was watching the conference championship game against Cincinnati last year. He put it to him a little bit in that game. I think he had like a $150 and at least one touchdown. He had a nice play where against off coverage where he kind of stemmed up this route on a post, ended up getting separation. The ball was away from his frame. He perfectly tracked it, just plucked it out the sky for a touchdown. And then he had another screen pass, I think, earlier in the game where he had to make, I think it was like 4 or 5 Cincinnati defenders miss, and ended up taking it for like 50 yards after the catch. So really, really productive player, really tough to tackle in space, a guy that can, beat you deep. He's kind of electric with the ball in his hands too. The biggest question with Dell is like, what is he going to weigh in at when he gets to the combine? It's, 155 pounds. I mean, you're in historic draft outlier territory, which is, not where you necessarily want to be. I think that Houston lists him around like 160. I think he really, really, really needs to get up to that 170 mark. If he can get up to that 170 mark, we're talking about a guy who could potentially threaten in the middle rounds of the draft. I think if we're talking about like 155 or even lighter, which some people might think, that's when we're kind of getting really concerned about his projection, because it does show up on film too. Like just in the one game that I watched last year against Cincinnati, like he was really good. But when some of those Cincinnati corners kind of got their hands on him down the field a little bit, the play strength was kind of showing up, which you'd expect for a guy that's that size. So
I can add a little bit on to Tank Dell. Was watching Clayton Tune because I tend to watch way too many quarterbacks. When it comes to the draft process, I try to exhaust as many of my resources just to watch as many as possible. But I ended up watching a little more of Tank Dell because of his ability to just release off the line of scrimmage. A guy who just really explodes out of his cuts, just extremely smooth with stringing moves together. Can really break off his stem smoothly. Guy that overall he can make some plays after the catch. The play strength, like you mentioned, is going to be a huge concern, though. He's probably going to be lucky to be listed at 160. He's not short like Tutu Atwell was. Like he's definitely longer than him. It's a lot more noticeable in terms of his frame, but he is skinny. He definitely needs to get up a little bit more. At least if he can get up into the 170 range, that would be huge for his stock overall. Because I'm not gonna be shocked if he measures around 155, 160 range because of just how his frame looks on film.
Yeah, that's Tutu was the obvious name that I was thinking of, and that's not really, And the thing is, Tutu was kind of a guy going into that draft where I was like, man, if you can get this dude on day 3 of the draft as a gadget guy, Tutu was a pretty good route runner. Like he could get separation underneath too. Local guy for me. So I watched a lot of him coming out. And then when I heard his name called in the second round of the draft, I was like, oh no, that is not good. Because you don't like when guys, to me, even if I like a player, while you can be happy for their success and their financial security that comes with being overdrafted, you worry about that too a little bit because expectations are through the roof when you're a second round pick, as opposed to like when you're a day 3 guy kind of coming
Yeah.
in and just trying to cut your teeth at the bottom of the roster. So, Dell's an interesting player. I definitely think that, he's a guy that can definitely benefit through gaining some weight and just in general having a nice combine. He's a day 3 guy for me. Like I said, not somebody that I'm expecting to go day 2, but it's hard to argue the production. I mean, it's been incredible there at Houston with Clayton Tune. They formed, quite the duo. So it's gonna be interesting to see what happens with him.
Tune's got the arm to get him downfield too. So
Yeah,
he,
Tune
he
throws
can
a good deep ball.
yeah, he can throw a good
Pretty
deep
ball.
ball. He's just a bit late at times, and that's a problem. He's a bit
Yeah.
slow footed.
Yeah, for sure.
But that's that'll be fun matchup to watch for sure.
All right, guys. Well, I think that wraps this episode up for us. We appreciate all of you guys' support. Just remember, you guys can subscribe to us at youtube.com/allsteelers or find us anywhere where you get your podcast. Enjoy a nice weekend of football, Saturday, Sunday football, and we will catch you guys next week.
Stay warm.